It's been almost a year since that night, but I still wake up in a cold sweat, replaying every moment in my head. I don't think I'll ever set foot in a hospital again. It all started with what was supposed to be a routine surgery. My wife, Sarah, had been dealing with gallbladder issues for a while, and her doctor finally recommended getting it removed. It wasn't an emergency, but she was in enough pain that we decided to go through with it. Living in a small town, our only option was the local hospital, a place with outdated equipment and a skeleton crew of overworked staff. We arrived early in the morning, the sky still gray with the first hints of dawn. Sarah was nervous but trying to hide it, cracking jokes to lighten the mood. I held her hand and reassured her it would be over before she knew it. Gallbladder removal was a common procedure, and the surgeon, Dr. Malcolm, had a good reputation, or so we thought. The waiting room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant beep of a monitor, the shuffle of nurses' feet. I kissed Sarah on the forehead before they wheeled her away, promising to be right there when she woke up. The surgery itself went smoothly, or so I was told. Dr. Malcolm came out about an hour later, pulling off his gloves and flashing a confident smile. "Everything went well," he said. "She'll be in recovery for a few hours. You can see her once she's awake." Relieved, I settled into a stiff chair in the waiting area, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. But as the hours dragged on, I started to get uneasy. It was well past the time they said Sarah would be awake. When I asked the nurse at the desk, she glanced at her chart and said Sarah was still being monitored, her tone dismissive. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Finally, a nurse came to get me. "She's awake," she said, but her expression was hard to read. "Follow me." When I walked into the recovery room, Sarah looked pale and disoriented, her eyes fluttering open and closed. She mumbled something I couldn't make out, her voice hoarse. I sat beside her, holding her hand, trying to comfort her. But as the anesthesia wore off, her mumbling turned to panicked whispers. He was in the room," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not the nurse, someone else." "What are you talking about?" I asked, leaning closer. Her eyes darted around the room, wild with fear. "I wasn't asleep the whole time. I woke up for a bit and there was someone there. Not the doctor. Not a nurse. He was watching me." I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the effects of the anesthesia. People say and imagine strange things when they're coming out of it. But the fear in her eyes wouldn't let me shake it so easily. That's when things started to spiral. Over the next hour, Sarah's condition got worse. She started shaking, breaking out in a cold sweat. The nurses insisted it was a reaction to the medication, but I could tell they were just guessing. Dr. Malcolm was nowhere to be found. I demanded to see him, and after what felt like forever, he finally appeared. But something about him seemed off. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. He avoided eye contact and kept glancing at the clock on the wall. "We're monitoring her closely," he said, his voice tight. "This isn't uncommon after surgery. She'll be fine." I didn't believe him. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her skin clammy. She gripped my hand with what little strength she had, her eyes pleading with me. "Don't leave me," she whispered. I promised I wouldn't. That's when I noticed something strange. The forebag attached to her arm had a label that didn't look right. The handwriting was smudged, almost like someone had written over it to cover something up. I pointed it out to the nurse, but she brushed it off, saying it must have been a mix-up. "Mix-up?" I snapped. "How does a hospital mix up medication?" The nurse didn't answer. Instead, she muttered something about getting the head nurse and walked out. I could feel my frustration turning to anger. Something was very wrong and no one was telling me the truth. It wasn't until Sarah's heart monitor started beeping erratically that the staff finally sprang into action. They rushed her out of the room, leaving me behind, helpless and terrified. I paced the hallway, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. That's when I noticed Dr. Malcolm slipping out of the building through a side door. I don't know what possessed me to follow him, but I did. He hurried down a dimly lit corridor that led to the hospital's old and used wing. My heart pounded as I trailed behind him, careful to stay out of sight. He stopped outside a door, glancing around nervously before slipping inside. I waited a few seconds before approaching. The door wasn't fully closed and I could hear voices inside. Peeking through the crack, I saw Dr. Malcolm speaking with another man, someone I didn't recognize. The room was cluttered with medical supplies and equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "We have to get rid of it," the other man said. "If they find out." "They won't," Dr. Malcolm snapped. "I've handled it before." "What about the woman?" "She'll be dead by morning," Malcolm replied coldly. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My stomach churned as I realized they were talking about Sarah. My Sarah. Before I could think, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was deafening in the silence, and both men turned toward the door. I bolted, running back the way I came, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the main part of the hospital. I found a nurse and told her everything. At first she looked skeptical, but when I described the old wing and what I'd heard, her face went pale. She called security and the police. It turns out Dr. Malcolm wasn't who he claimed to be. His medical license had been revoked years ago for malpractice, and he'd been operating under a fake identity. The man he was meeting with was an accomplice, helping him cover up botched surgeries and suspicious deaths. Sarah survived, but just barely. The medication in her forehead had been tampered with, likely to hide Malcolm's mistakes during the surgery. The police said if I hadn't found her when I did, she wouldn't have made it through the night. Dr. Malcolm was arrested, along with his accomplice, and the hospital launched a full investigation. They tried to reassure us that changes would be made, but it was too little, too late. Sarah's still recovering, both physically and emotionally. We've moved to a different town, far away from that hospital, but the memories linger. Every time I look at her, I'm reminded of how close I came to losing her, and how sometimes, the people you trust the most are the ones who put you in the most danger.